Welcome everyone. We are going to get started in just a moment. You have made it to the Addressing the Recovery Support Needs of Persons with IDD presentation, hosted by the South-Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center and presented by Jordan Snelly. We are going to give folks another minute or so to get into the room. So if you will hold on for just a moment, that would be great. But also, if you could put who you are, where you're from in the chat, and what do you do? That would be really cool. I love getting to see where everybody's from. And again, for those of you who are just joining us, we're going to be starting in just a moment. We're letting folks come on in. We're asking people to introduce themselves, who you are, where you're from, and what you do in the chat. Wow, this is such a great group of people. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Hi, my name is Jessie Davis. My pronouns are she and they. Both sets work perfectly fine for me. I'm a peer supporter from Texas that has recently moved to Illinois, and so now I get to learn how to be in the cold. I am very excited to be here and to be able to introduce this presentation to you all and to introduce Jordan. But first, let me tell you about the South-Southwest MHPTC. We are SAMHSA funded, and we also do presentations like this or support people to do presentations like this. And this isn't only for peer supporters, even though I'm a peer supporter and I'm a peer supporter through and through, we support the full mental health workforce. And we are so excited that you all are here. I do have to have this acknowledgement slide up. We are supported by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and I have to say the opinions expressed herein are the view of TTC Network and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. So with the MHPPC network, we provide support to the workforce, as I mentioned, and we do have this slide up here sharing about how we use affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all activities. And when we say recovery-oriented, we mean that that language is strengths-based and hopeful, inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences, healing-centered and trauma-responsive, inviting to individuals participating in their own journeys. And I would also say we still need to update this image where currently it says person first. I would say we use person choice language and free of labels. So when somebody tells me or us, this is how they identify, we're going to utilize that wording for them. We use non-judgmental language and we avoid assumption. We're respectful, clear, and understandable, and consistent with our actions, policies, and procedures. We also have a code of conduct here for the events that we hold within the South-Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. And I'm going to leave the slide up, but essentially it just says be nice. And if there's something going on, I will message you first and let you know, hey, we may need you to stop that, or we do need you to stop that. And I will also say we've never had to utilize this since we implemented it. And we have wonderful folks who attend our things, and I hope we get to continue that. But if for any reason I do reach out and you are not stopping whatever that is, I will potentially be removing you from this space because we want to make sure that this is a space where we can continue learning. So I'm going to read this out, that we invite everyone to help us achieve a safe, respectful, inclusive, and positive environment for learning. And to that end, we reserve the right to remove participants who don't follow this code or who participate in a harmful way after being asked to collaborate with us on this matter. When you participate participate in an event hosted by us, you are contributing to the overall experience, which makes us all accountable to each other. And so I do have a few housekeeping items as well. We have done everything we can to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up using your registration information. You are able to unmute and share your video, but we ask that you do not do so unless the presenter has asked you to do so with your voice and unmuting, but we'd love to see your faces. If you have a question or a comment, you can use the chat box, and we also have the Q&A feature enabled, so you can separate questions for the presenter there if you would like. We also have CEUs for you today. You can earn up to 2 CEUs, but you need to pass the final exam with 70%, and a certificate will be emailed to you within a week after today. You are responsible for checking in with your own licensing or credentialing board to make sure that CEUs are accepted. I can tell you that we have some agreements with Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and New Mexico for peer support CEUs specifically, and I know for sure we can do Texas-based CEUs for social work. Outside of that, please double check to make sure that it works for your credential. This session is being recorded, and I'm really excited to have this available afterwards. This is a slide that shares what the MHTTC regions look like. So you are participating in an event for Region 6, which you can see at the purple one at the bottom. Like I mentioned with the states before, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and the indigenous communities within those borders are our region. We are so excited to work with you. And with that, I get to now present Jordan Snelly, our presenter for today. So Jordan is a mental health peer specialist in Texas and a person in long-term recovery from intellectual and developmental differences with co-occurring mental health challenges. And let me pull up his full bio. So his bio says Jordan Snelly is a mental health peer support specialist in Texas and a person in long-term recovery from intellectual and developmental differences with co-occurring mental health challenges. Jordan partly defines his own recovery in relation to the opportunities available to present and educate the community on topics around supporting persons with IDD. Jordan was awarded the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Texas Chapter's Empowerment Award for excellence in promotion of self-advocacy at its 47th annual convention on November 16, 2023. In recognition of Jordan's self-advocacy efforts around expanding supports available to persons with intellectual and/or developmental differences. And with that, Jordan, I am so excited to hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. So now I can share my screen. Okay. I think it's this one. Maybe. Do y'all see my PowerPoint?
I do.
Okay, cool. I did it the right way. Okay. So and if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand throughout. Jesse and Glenn, and Jennifer, if y'all can keep an eye out for hands and let me know, I would appreciate it. Or you can put your questions in the chat and I'll get to them at the end. All right, so welcome. Today we're going to be discussing addressing the recovery support needs of persons with IDD. So key purpose. So for the purpose of this presentation, IDD will stand for persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities and related sensory processing disorders with or without co-occurring mental health and/or substance use diagnosis. Key objectives. So we will define intellectual and developmental disabilities, identify different potential support needs of persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including vital support needs around sensory processing disorders like tactile dysfunction and proprioceptive dysfunction. and execute a more trauma-informed and person-centered approach to interacting with persons with proprioceptive dysfunction and or tactile dysfunction. So what are intellectual and developmental disabilities? So according to U.S. Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human and Development, intellectual and developmental disabilities is defined as differences that are usually present at birth and that uniquely affect the trajectory of the individual's physical, intellectual, and or emotional development. Many of these conditions affect multiple body parts or systems. Now, this definition, I actually sent them and they actually posted it. They used the word disorder previously. And so when we're talking about persons with IDD, it's uh not necessarily that trauma informed and person centered to be using the word disabilities, because a synonym for disability is disabled and a synonym for disabled is broken, and people with IDD are not broken. They just happen to have differences that in certain environments they need a little extra support. And so it is on my bucket list to maybe someday get the DSM to change IDD to intellectual and developmental differences instead of intellectual and developmental disabilities, because the acronym would still be the same. You're just changing the word disability to differences, which is more person centered and technically, in my opinion, more accurate. So, what is the prevalence of IDD in Texas alone? Does anyone have any guesses? And you can either unmute or you can put your guess in the chat. And I have the chat pulled up. I don't know that y'all will see that I have it pulled up, but I do have it pulled up. Any guesses? All right. So, oh yeah, I forget, when I click on my laptop screen, I had to click back on my external monitor screen for my clicker to work. So according to the Texas Workforce Commission, the number of Texans with intellectual and developmental disabilities is 485,000. Excuse me, and that comes from TWC's Twitter page, which of course now, as y'all are probably aware, Twitter is now called X. But that's where I pulled this from. So what are some examples of intellectual and developmental disabilities? So ADHD, and this is one that trips some providers up within the mental health and or substance use field. Um, And it's because if you look in the DSM, ADHD is actually classified as a neurodevelopmental disability. So, any of you in here that are mental health or substance use providers, if you are treating people with ADHD, you're already providing treatment to someone with IDD, technically. Asperger's, which is now included in autism spectrum disorders in the DSM, autism spectrum disorders. I keep them separate because there are people with Asperger's that identify as having Asperger's, and then there are people with autism that feel autism and Asperger's are two separate things. And so I keep it separate just to kind of make sure I don't offend someone. Cerebral palsy, Chunk Jensen syndrome, which is one of the two syndromes I have, Down syndrome, dysgraphia, and dyslexia. Does anyone know the difference between dysgraphia and dyslexia, or does anyone want to take a guess? Okay, so dysgraphia, uh, sort of, Ashley, you're on the right track. So dysgraphia deals with, yes, exactly, gray. So dysgraphia deals with writing, and dyslexia just deals with reading. And I just wanted to point that out because just to make sure y'all understand they're not the same. So, written expression disorder. Does anyone want to take a guess at what this is? And I know it sounds made up, but this is not made up. So, expressions disorder. So, persons with written expression disorder struggle to put their ideas into writing. They also make frequent mistakes in grammar and punctuation. Written expression disorder often co occurs with other learning challenges. Two of the most common are dyslexia and ADHD. And the important thing to remember is written expression disorder is lifelong and caused by differences in the brain. So, those of you who support persons with IDD, and those of you who are peer support specialists like I am, one of the most traumatizing things you can do to a peer that has written expression disorder is to mandate journaling, unless you are willing to accommodate them by allowing them to maybe use speech to text software or do a oral journal where they speak instead of write. So, what are some examples of possible support needs? So, the first one, and this is a big one that I run into and I have to advocate for all the time, is ensure your policies do not violate 45 CFR Part 84 if your organization receives federal financial assistance. And CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations. So, what does that mean? Well, we will look at this. Y'all see a web page now, right? Yes? Okay. Thank you. All right. So this is Code of Federal Regulations, Title 45, Part 84. So this is the non-discrimination on the basis of handicap in programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance. So one of the biggest ones is Medicaid. S- uh, and that's where a lot of trauma and advocacy goes into. So for those of you that support persons with IDD, it's important that you are ready to support in helping people feel with IDD feel heard and helping them learn how to advocate. So when we're talking about Title 45, Part 84, the act defines handicap as a handicapped person as has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. Oh, has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more of the major life activities. Sorry, I missed that. But that's key. And major life activities is defined by Part 84, means functions such as caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, and working. All right. So now we're going to talk about the discrimination that this says agencies that receive federal financial aid cannot do. So it says no qualified handicapped person shall, on the basis of handicap, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or otherwise be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity which receives federal financial assistance. So, two of the biggest ones that I run into and have to advocate for all the time is when an agency tries to provide a qualified handicapped person with an aid, benefit, or service that is not as effective as that provided to others. And then the other one that I run into a lot is a recipient. And by recipient, they mean the agency receiving federal financial assistance. An agency may not directly or through contractual or other arrangements utilize criteria or methods of administration that have the purpose or effect of defeating or substantially impairing accomplishment of the objectives of the recipient's program or activity with respect to handicapped persons. So what does that mean? So those of you who provide peer support, and this gets kind of sticky, but underneath this act, you should not be denying peer support services to persons with IDD. I know that peer support is something that is new within the sense of IDD, but just because someone has an intellectual or developmental disability and they're not as easily able to communicate verbally does not mean that they should be denied a service that could potentially help them become more independent, especially if that becoming more dependent is part of their plan. Another example, and this is one that I am fighting personally, is with Texas HHSC. So within Texas HHSC, and this is what is happening to Texans with rare genetic disorders that cause obesity. So Texas HHSC's current stance on weight management treatment is that they only want to pay for stimulants, anorexic medication, fat prevention absorption medication, or weight loss surgery. And how this is discriminatory towards Texans with rare genetic disorders like Bardet-Biedl syndrome, which I have, as well as Chung-Jansen syndrome, which I have that as well, is while there is a new medication called Imcivree, which is the only FDA approved medication for persons with Bardet-Biedl syndrome, those of us that are deathly allergic are being denied access to GLP-1 antagonists. And how that is discriminatory is because when you look at the research on GLP-1 antagonists, it shows that yes, GLP-1 antagonists help people with type 2 diabetes, but one key feature of type 2 diabetes that is also part of Bardet-Biedl syndrome is insulin resistance, as well as in some cases with type 2 diabetes, you have something called leptin resistance. Leptin is a hormone that is a satiety hormone, so it helps the person realize when they're full, and it also helps with the body being able to process glucose correctly. And so what happens is what the research has shown is not only do GLP-1 antagonists help with type 2 diabetes, it also helps with leptin resistance and insulin resistance. So what's happening is Texas HHSC is saying that people with Bardet-Biedl syndrome that are deathly allergic to IMCIVRE. And by deathly allergic, I mean you go into anaphylactic shock. You are not sick enough to get GLP-1 antagonists until you develop type 2 diabetes. Uh, and so there's that aspect, which then limits the lifestyle program that persons with Bardet-Biedl and Chung-Jensen syndrome are put on, because medication has to be a component due to the impairment within the for Bardet-Biedl syndrome, it's impairment within the MC4R pathway. With Chung-Jensen syndrome, it's an impairment within the PHIP gene. And so so it's limiting uh the g- the our ability to meet goals of our lifestyle plan. And then the other factor is you're allowing Texans who have type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, and or leptin resistance to have access to GLP-1 antagonists, but you're not allowing persons with Bardet-Biedl syndrome or Chung-Jensen syndrome with leptin resistance and or insulin resistance to have access to the same types of medication that have been shown effective for uh, insulin resistance and leptin resistance. So what you're doing is basically saying, you're discriminating because our disability is Bardet-Biedl or Chung-Jensen syndrome instead of type 2 diabetes. And that is not right. And that's kind of one example of the fight persons with rare genetic disorders have to fight with Texas HHSC and other agencies that receive federal financial assistance. And so when you're supporting people with IDD, especially persons with rare genetic syndromes, it's important to make sure that you are taking a person-centered and trauma-informed approach, because we're already having to go through enough trauma trying to advocate to get what we need. All right, so that's my spiel on making sure you follow federal statute. So let's get back to the PowerPoint. All right. Are there any questions before I move on? Because I know I just covered a lot and it might have sounded like a rant, and I didn't mean to rant. I just wanted y'all to kind of understand some of the unique challenges persons with IDD, especially those with rare genetic syndromes, are facing and the types of support that they need. Nope. All right. All right. So another possible support need is using, and this is for those of you that work for LMHAs or LIDAs, using money follows the person funding to attend trainings like people planning together. So there is this funding source called Money Follows the Person. And this is the funding source that typically, from my understandings, LIDAs have access to. So what is people planning together? So people planning together is a peer-to-peer model. There are two trainers in this model, one person with an intellectual or developmental disability, IDD, and one trainer who does not have a disability. The lead trainer is the person with IDD who guides participants with IDD to develop an outcome and action steps to take to their annual planning meeting. The co-trainer without a disability supports the lead trainer as needed. Some participants may need support to assist in the training activities. The success of the training depends a great deal on the participants having a safe space to share their dreams, goals, and take risks to pursue their own life outcomes. The peer-to-peer training model is very powerful. Participants can see another person with lived experience leading the training, a person which is a person with similar experiences. So if you have more questions about this, reach out to me because I am actually working on becoming a people planning together trainer. And I'm actually actively in the process of getting certified. So what are some other examples of possible support needs? Hold on a second. I got dry mouth. Ugh. Only one person talking at a time. So for some persons with IDD, and I'm including myself in this one because this is a big one for me as well. Having one person talking at a time is really, really important, especially if we're attending a training or we're attending college or some other educational setting, because what can happen is the more people that talk at the same time, it can become overstimulating to those of us with IDD. And when we get overstimulated, it gets harder to focus. And so then we're not really able to learn. Only one subject matter presented at a time. So again, another and I'm talking about myself again. So a lot of the examples I give are from my personal experience, but as well as someone with IDD, but as well as things that I have observed as I have supported others with IDD. So what can happen when you're jumping from topic to topic is some persons with IDD have a processing delay. And so if you don't have a clear transition, then the person with IDD may not realize we're talking about a completely different subject. And so they get lost, which can then be very overwhelming and possibly overstimulating and very traumatizing, to be honest, because I'm trying to process what we were talking about, and now you're talking about something that doesn't even sound remotely similar to what I was just processing. Use of visual aids. So, for some persons with IDD, having a visual aid helps them learn or can also help them learn how to advocate, um, or learn important social skills like personal space. And we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. Communication assistance. Now, this is a big one, and this is one that is very broad and does very much so vary depending on the person. So there are some persons with IDD who might not be as able to communicate verbally, and so they communicate via action. For example, my best friend since 6th grade has Down syndrome, and if we're talking about communication, He's on the lower end of communication. He can say people's names. He can say like hi, bye, mm, but not really like put a sentence together. And so one way I know he's hungry whenever we're hanging out, because we usually hang out on Fridays and sometimes on Saturdays, is he flaps his arms like chicken wings because his favorite food is chicken. Another example of how my best friend communicates through action, uh, and I and his mom and some of the family friends have given him this nickname, but his nickname for when he is ready for people to leave and go back home is the bringer and putter honor of shoes. So my my best friend, um, he tries to tell me when he's ready for me to leave, but if he feels that I'm not picking up on it, he will actually, when I wear my sandals instead of my leg braces to his house, he will actually put my sandals on my feet, and then he turns the TV off. So, it's important to understand sometimes persons with IDD communicate via action. And so it's important to keep that in mind. Another way communication assistants can look is persons who use speech generating devices. I can tell you from personal experience from having coworkers that use speech generating devices in a pilot that I helped with a few years ago. One of the most non-person centered and traumatizing things you can do to a person that uses a speech generating device is try and finish their sentence for them. They want you to let them finish typing out what they want to say and hit enter so that they have the same opportunity to be they want to be they want you to listen to hear them, not listen to respond. Listening to hear someone and listening to respond is two different things. And so thankfully, they were very understanding that this was my first time working with others that happen to use a speech generating device. So I honestly had no clue that trying to finish a sentence for them was so traumatizing. And to be honest, I kind of looked like a fool because once I did give them the time to finish what they were typing, I did not correctly guess what they were trying to say. So that's another reason it's probably a good idea to let persons with speech generating devices finish typing out what they want to say, because if you don't and you're wrong, you're going to look like a fool. So if you don't want to look like a fool and you want to use a person centered and trauma informed approach for supporting or working with persons with speech generating devices, it is better to be patient and let them type everything out and hit enter and listen than it is to try to cut things short and assume what they're trying to say. And then specific activity strategies when dealing with proprioceptive dysfunction and or tactile dysfunction and their associated seeking behaviors and or avoiding behaviors. And we will be getting into that momentarily. All right. So now I have two examples of visual aids I want to show y'all. Let me scroll up. Y'all see a worksheet now, right? I always like to double check because I don't trust Zoom. I do not trust Zoom. So I always like to check. All right, so this is a worksheet that I actually developed and got copyrighted through the US Copyright Office, which was a very interesting process, to say the least. And it's titled Using Self Awareness to Advocate for Support Needs in Different Environments. And when I created this worksheet, I was working on creating a tool for persons with IDD to help them learn how to advocate for themselves in different environments. But what ended up happening was I created a tool that could pretty much be used by anyone if needed. So that was pretty cool once I kinda figured that out slash had others point that out. So, uh, first we talk about define self-awareness, then we define support needs, and this is my definition of support needs. When I tried using Google, they gave me stuff that was too clinical. Like, I kinda understood what they were saying, but the whole purpose of this tool was that it could be used by persons, um, with processing differences in how they process information. So I wanted to be as clear and non-medical as possible. And so then we talk about what our strengths, and there's an example, what our challenges, and then there's an example. Then there's a box for them to write down their strengths and challenges. And when you think about and I'll just kind of give a little bit of a tip here for those of you who might be job searching or support persons who are job searching. When you go to an interview and the potential employer asks you what are your weaknesses, what they're really asking is what are your challenges. And so what I have found works for me, and maybe it works for others too, but for me, what I have found that works is if I'm able to rephrase that and let them know what some of my challenges are, but then highlight what some of my strengths are, but as well as um, speak up and mention what supports I need to help address my challenges. Um, for me personally, it has helped figure out whether or not the job would be a good fit or not. Because if I can't get the supports I need, then the job's not gonna be very successful, and it's gonna be very stressful and potentially very traumatizing. And so, when I use this and I do a presentation on this worksheet specifically, I like to kind of give this tip so those that are seeking employment kind of know it's a little bit of a tricky question when employers ask you what your weaknesses are. And at least for me, when I learn to rephrase it and highlight my strengths as well as show that I know exactly what I need to help mitigate the challenges, I have a much better chance of, if not getting to the next round of interviews, if it's a multi-round interview process, it's helps me get the job. That's actually how I ended up with my previous job. Actually, believe it or not, I was able to let them know what my challenges were. It was my first job as a mental health peer specialist, and I was just upfront and let them know I have no experience with documentation. Like, I don't even know what that is supposed to look like. But I also let them know, I'm willing to learn, and um, you know, and I wear leg braces, but the easiest support for that is, when I'm at my desk, just let me have my shoes off, and when I have to go around the building, I'll put them back on. And then highlighting my strength of, well, I have intellectual and developmental differences as well. And so that's kind of at least here in Texas, uh, from what I have seen, and those of you who are here from Texas, if you have seen differently, you're more than welcome to speak up in the chat. But from what I have seen, there are not many certified peer support specialists who have IDD or are as open to identify and be open about that, which is okay. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, because I wasn't always as willing to be as open as I am now, just because of all the trauma that I've gone through in my life. But I've kind of learned how to be open in a way that I'm not oversharing, and I'm able to relate to others and help them navigate. And so then we talk about personality traits. Then we covered the 4 steps to using self-awareness to identify support needs in different environments. And then I give an example of what it looks like to advocate for support needs in work environment, advocating for support needs in college academic environment. And I labeled it this way because typically when I'm doing this particular presentation, it's usually to transition age youth and or adults. But this worksheet could also work within the kindergarten through uh 12th grade. Of course, the younger kids would need help figuring this out, but the older kids, like ninth grade and up, should be able to do this with support. And then example of advocating for support need and social environment. And then there's a space for them to practice. So that's one visual aid. Now, the other visual aid, and I will not spend as much time talking on this one because we will actually be watching an interview with Carrie Dunn Buron, who is the creator of the Incredible 5-point scale. So the Incredible 5-point scale was created by Carrie Dunn Buron and Mitzi Curtis. And so let me open this. Okay, y'all see the scale now, right? I'm always gonna double check. All right, thank you. All right, so the Incredible 5-point scale. So of course the first column is numbers, and then the next column is what that number looks like for the person externally. So what it looks and sounds like. And then the next column is what it feels like. So that's what it feels like to them. And then the last column is I can try to. Now, the key thing with the I can try to column, this is where you list coping mechanisms, but you really want to list the coping mechanisms that'll at least de escalate you one level. The whole point of this is to help, it's sort of kind of a way to help the person who is overstimulated or overwhelmed cope and get past the overstimulation or overwhelmness. But it can also be used, and Carrie Dunn Buron talks about this in her interview, to help teach skills to persons with IDD. And this is actually mine for work, for my anxiety. But with that, I'm going to, y'all see the video now, right? All right. I'm gonna start it and let it go a few seconds and then stop to verify y'all hear the sound, because I'm pretty sure I shared my screen with the sound enabled, but I want to make sure before we go too far.
Most of the rim of it is green, you guys. That's why it.
Okay, did y'all hear the video? Okay, cool. Now, those of you that are using headphones, the way this was recorded, it's only going to come through one side. So when I start this, if you're only hearing sound through one side of your headphone, it's not you and it's not your headphones. It's the way this was recorded. Just thought I would throw that out there so that way, if y'all notice that, you're not thrown off. So here we go.
It's see-through
looks
because we
clear,
shoot on a
yes.
green screen. But so it's a system that you developed with your colleague Bitsy Curtis. Can you tell us what ideas and research contributed to the development of the 5-point scale?
Yes, certainly. The idea is that we were looking at the traditional or the most common autism learning styles, such as using visuals to learn, that being a learning strength, whereas a lot of auditory input and language concepts seem to be less of a strength. And Simon Baron-Cohen from Cambridge University developed a learning theory that he called hypersystemizing and hypo-emotionalizing. And by that he meant that most individuals on the autism spectrum seem to learn best through systems and had more difficulty learning through emotional language. So what we started doing was taking social and emotional concepts that we were trying to teach and put them on a scale. So everything got broken into 5 parts, whether it was voice volume or stress, personal distance, language, swearing, that kind of thing. So no matter what it was, we could just take that concept, that idea, and break it into 5 parts. So we're teaching social and emotional concepts and ideas to people who otherwise have difficulty grasping them or understanding. Yeah, so that was it. And we started with the voice scale, trying to teach a middle school boy that in the hallway while passing, you needed to use number 3 voice. Rather than telling him he was too loud or he needed to talk softer, those felt very judging to him, and he responded poorly to those prompts. So instead, we found that if we reviewed a voice volume scale prior to going out to passing in the hallway, and he clearly understood that the hallway was a number 3, then all we had to do was either hold up a number 3 or prompt him that he needed to bring it down to a 3.
And when you realized how well this worked, you had to have been really excited.
Oh, yes, yes. In the first edition of the book, I wrote that we started thinking that every problem in the world could be solved via a 5-point scale. So in the beginning, it was overwhelming. It worked so well and so fast. We started making scales for the teachers that we were working with at the time, and for other school districts. And so we finally decided to write a book about it. We could hand them something.
Okay. Tell us how the 5-point scale differs from behavior management tools.
Traditional behavior management tools usually look at what to do and what not to do, And this is really more of, and actually happened after the fact in most cases. So you earn a jelly bean, or you lose a jelly bean, or you earn a token or a smiley face. So even positive behavior management, positive reinforcement is really different. This is a cognitive behavioral approach to teaching, and it is all about teaching social and emotional concepts in a very direct and highly systematic way. If somebody has explosive behavior, has problems with their emotional regulation, and with a minor disappointment completely falls apart, in a traditional behavioral system, I might try to use some sort of motivation to get this person to control those emotions. The 5-point scale really looks at the idea that skills can be taught, and that something like emotional regulation is a skill. And that's been pretty well documented in recent cognitive neuroscience. So emotional regulation as a skill can be taught. So you take a skill like voice volume, a simple skill like that, and rather than give the boy in the hallway a token for using the right voice volume in the hallway, I'm focusing my attention on teaching him how to recognize his own voice volume and adjusting based on the number scale of the environment, if that makes sense.
Right. And this can also be used in the home. There's an example in the book, The Incredible Home Scale. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, the Incredible Home Scale was a scale written for a young girl who oftentimes lost emotional control when they were visiting her grandparents or family members or friends. And so the recommendation was to try to teach her through the use of a 5-point scale. And the one in this case was, I can handle this. I'm fine. So that if that's how she's feeling, she would be at a number 1. I'm feeling a little bit nervous. That was a number 2. Please don't talk to me. That was a number 3. I need some space, and that was number 4. And I need to leave, and that was number 5. So in working with mom on using this scale with her daughter, we talked about the importance of validating her daughter's ratings. So even if mom was having the best time ever, if her daughter rated herself at a 4, she needed to wrap it up and assume that she was pushing her daughter beyond her daughter's ability to control her emotions, and she was going to lose control if they didn't leave. And it worked really, really well. Her daughter ended up being able to check in with her mom, and they would check in throughout the visit. So if they were there for Thanksgiving dinner, or if they were there for some other social reason, she would have her daughter check in with her on an hourly basis, so that she could say, okay, where are you? What number are you at right now? So that she could proactively kind of intervene and make a good decision before her daughter lost control.
It's really amazing. And what I love about
All right, so that's what we're going to watch of that. I do have the link to this video on my resources slide. So if y'all want to watch the whole interview on your own, you will be able to do so. All right, y'all see my PowerPoint now, right? All right, thank you. All right, now before we move on, does anyone have any questions about what we covered? because this next stuff is a little intense. And so I didn't want y'all to have a question and then forget it, because we are about to cover some very information that's not usually talked about. At least within the mental health and substance use field. All right, I'm not seeing any hands. So, due to the topic of sensory processing disorders and their associated seeking behaviors and avoidant behaviors not being covered very often within the behavioral health and substance use fields and or among the recovery community at large, some of the material and or examples used may be triggering to some attendees. However, the way the material is presented, including the personal examples shared, are to help make sure attendees understand this very important topic, so attendees can start providing more trauma-informed and person-centered support to persons with IDD with or without co-occurring mental health and or substance use. So, I like to start with this quote because this is very relevant when we're talking about sensory processing disorders, especially tactile dysfunction. So, the severity of one's disability does not determine their level of potential. The greatest barriers that persons with disabilities have to overcome are not steps or curbs, it's expectations. And that is by Karen Clay, who is a disability advocate. So, what is proprioceptive dysfunction? So, proprioceptive dysfunction is issues with body awareness and understanding one's positions in space. Persons with proprioceptive dysfunction exhibit seeking and or avoiding behaviors attributed to proprioceptive sensory signals. Example, bear hugs. So, what is proprioceptive seeking behavior? And if you're wanting CEU credits, I would pay very close attention to the rest of the slides because the whole exam is on this part. And I have seen people not pass because they're getting things mixed up. So, but you will be able to reattempt the exam once. So if you don't pass the first time, you'll get one more chance, and then after that, I'm sorry, you cannot have credit. So proprioceptive seekers crave sensory stimulation via movement, pressure, and physical contact with others. Seekers may seem to need constant stimulation. However, they tend to become more deregulated as they take in more input. Many seekers experience symptoms associated with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, such as low impulse control, inability to focus, and behavioral problems. So proprioceptive seekers may bump or crash into people or objects on purpose, enjoy rough play, and constantly seem to be wrestling with siblings or friends, tend to stand too close to others or touch others without permission, crave bear hugs, holding hands, and other kinds of physical pressure. I promise you, there is a question on the test where one of these bullet points is the answer. Do I need to pause so people can take notes? I'll give y'all a couple of seconds. So how do you support proprioceptive seeking behavior? I promise you there is a question on the test that asks this. Assign tasks that put pressure on joints, such as carrying groceries or laundry. Encourage safe climbing, jumping, and contact games. Use a weighted blanket and deep pressure therapy when needed. So, weighted blanket is good for deep pressure. Another option, and I actually have one with me, is a weighted vest. However, my vest does not look like what you're probably thinking of, because the vests that look like life jackets, they do not make weighted vests that look like life jackets in big and tall size. So my weighted vest is one that is used for people who might want to like add weight for helping build strength while walking. So I will take my headset off and I will put it on so y'all can see it. So 1 second. Okay, let me move my camera down a little bit. So this is my vest. It looks like a mini bulletproof vest on me. Uh, but it's actually very effective at helping me focus if I'm struggling, or if I'm overstimulated. It's helpful in helping me calm down. And it actually has straps that go along the side, and so I can adjust the tension or the deep pressure. So if I need more of a squeeze, I can have someone help me pull the side straps tighter. Give hugs, cuddles, or other kinds of physical contact when asked, and appropriate for the relationship between person seeking physical contact and person giving physical contact. So those of you whose ethics may not allow this, that is okay. And I'm not trying to get you to violate your ethics. That's not what I'm saying. However, do not be surprised if you need to teach the different relationships where physical contact, like hugs, cuddling, etc., are and are not appropriate, and be prepared to teach or refer to appropriate support for teaching this important concept. One resource might be a social skills therapist, but if we're talking about weighted vests and weighted blankets, it would be an occupational therapist, because they're the ones that are trained in the use of weighted blankets and weighted vests. Although the one thing I will say about use of weighted vests is you typically only want to wear them up to 30 minutes, because after that, the body typically adapts to the extra weight. So it's not as beneficial. And when your body adapts, you can forget you're wearing your vest. And the weighted vests are not meant for people to be wearing when they're doing twisting and turning motions. They're mostly meant for grounding, and in my case, with the type that I have, for what I believe the military term to be is rucking, which is walking. So what is proprioceptive avoidant behavior? So proprioceptive avoiders are highly sensitive to movement and pressure, and tend to become overwhelmed or distracted by physical contact. Avoiders often have extreme or upsetting reactions to even very mild stimulation. As a result, they can appear withdrawn or defensive and have trouble fitting in with their peers. They also frequently experience symptoms associated with anxiety disorders and engage in repetitive self-soothing behaviors. Now, these self-soothing behaviors can be either positive or negative. So, one example of positive is rocking back and forth. One example of negative would be cutting themselves. So proprioceptive avoiders may avoid physical contact with others, appear very timid around peers and avoid physical play, become anxious in crowded spaces or when standing even somewhat close to others, be unable to properly assess risk in their physical environment. For example, they may be they may believe they can fall into the small gap between the floor and an elevator. I will also mention one of these bullet points is the answer to a question on the test. Warm, how to support proprioceptive behavior, avoidant behavior. So you can warn family and friends ahead of time that hugging and touching is not desired. Give verbal cues regarding your surroundings and properly contextualize the risks. There is a gap in the floor by the elevator. It is smaller than your foot. You cannot fall in. Let's step over it together. All right. Stacy, did you mean this one or did you mean this one? This one. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to keep my eye on the chat as I present. Let me know when you're good, Stacy, because I don't want to move on before you're ready.
Give me 1 second. I will be done with this slide.
No, you're good. I started to go a little fast, and that's okay. I sometimes do that without realizing it. So
You're good.
please speak up because I can go a little fast without even noticing.
I'm good. You can change it now. Thank you.
You're welcome. I can tell you one of these bullet points is on the test as an answer, I believe, if my memory serves correctly. So now we'll talk about what is tactile dysfunction. And the other thing I will say about the test is typically when people fail, it's because they mix up tactile dysfunction and proprioceptive dysfunction. So remember, tactile deals with the sense of touch, proprioceptive deals with spatial awareness. So tactile dysfunction, people with tactile dysfunction feel certain sensations more strongly than most people do and or completely different than others. And so people with tactile dysfunction can exhibit seeking and or avoiding behaviors attributed to tactile sensory signals. So one example would be tickling. So what is tactile seeking behavior? So tactile seekers are desensitized to touch and crave sensory stimulation via specific textures, temperatures, and deep pressure. Seekers may seem to need constant stimulation. However, they tend to become more deregulated as they take in more input. Many seekers experience symptoms associated with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, such as low impulse control, inability to focus, and behavioral problems. So what happens within the mental health and substance use field is you get providers as well as members within the recovery community at large who seem to think that only persons with autism can have sensory processing disorders. And that is not true. Okay. And I know that because I have both of these types of processing disorders, and I have ADHD. So it's not just persons with autism. So tactile seekers may prefer toys, clothing, and food with varied or specific textures. Constantly touch or fiddle with clothing, surfaces, or other objects. Crave hugs, kisses, and other frequent or prolonged contact with others. Tend to play too rough and accidentally harm others while playing. Have difficulty recognizing and respecting others' personal boundaries, and have higher than normal pain threshold and might not notice minor injuries. All right, hold on with me for a second because I need to take the vest off because I really don't need it on right now. There we go. Phew. All right, so now we're going to talk a little more on craving hugs, kisses, and other frequent or prolonged contact with others and the difficulty recognizing and respecting others' personal boundaries. But I need to use the whiteboard because I like to use a diagram. And I will go ahead and be upfront and honest right now. I am not the best artist in the world. So the important thing to understand, and y'all see the whiteboard now, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. There's the chat box. It disappeared for a second. All right, so the important thing to understand is for some persons with IDD, before they start getting the supports they need, when you're talking about recognizing personal space and touching people and things along that nature is for some persons with IDD, and this is including myself, we do not we look at personal space as one bubble, meaning that everyone has the same definition as I do, which for me meant that everyone was okay with me being close enough to where I could hug them. And I usually did without asking because I didn't understand that that can be an issue. It took a while. And so what this is not accurate depiction. So the way I learned about how to understand personal space and boundaries is instead of it being one circle, and again, I'm horrible artist, but the way I learned through my social skills therapist, ironically, is when you think about boundaries and personal space, it's more like a target you shoot arrows at, where the innermost circle is typically your family and then maybe your lifelong friends. And then if you have one, a life partner. And then the next space would probably be your friends. And maybe your providers after you've gotten to know them and have developed that relation, the provider, uh, I'll say provider consumer relationship, or provider client relationship. And then the outermost circle is the strangers and uh, acquaintances and when you first start a job, technically your coworkers are out here as well as your boss. And so the other thing some persons with IDD don't understand is that when you break it down this way, this is not a static model, meaning that people can move inward as well as outward. So that means, just because, you have someone that is a family member and they're in your innermost circle, as far as using a target diagram to talk about personal space and boundaries, they do not have to stay there if they do something horrible to you. And I will just kind of leave it at that. Because I don't want to get into too many details of what that could mean. So it's important to understand, it's or life partner. You start out with someone you think is great, and then something happens. It's okay to kick them out of your inner circle. But it's also kind of important to kind of understand, you might have friends that y'all get really close, but then as time moves on and as you kind of develop a relationship with a life partner, or they develop a relationship with a life partner, y'all may not be as close, and that's okay. So this is how I learned about personal space and recognizing boundaries, and it was super helpful. The other thing that some persons with IDD don't necessarily understand until it's broken down in a way that they can comprehend the information is, just because you have a friend that is okay with doing something one time does not mean that they're okay doing that all the time. And that was something I had to learn the hard way. Um, for example, one thing that I like doing is being goofy and silly and playful, and it's very distressing to be able to like cut loose and be silly and playful. But what has happened in the past is I don't understand that my friends that were okay with doing that, like when it was just the two of us hanging out at their house or my house, that doesn't necessarily mean they're comfortable with that, like if we're out in public or if we're hanging out with other friends. And so that's one way persons with IDD, and it is one way how I lost a lot of friends, because I did not understand that there are different activities that, while people are okay with it in one environment, that does not mean they are okay with it in all environments. So let's get back to the PowerPoint, because I'm not done with this topic yet. I'm just done with the whiteboard. All right, let me pull up the chat again because it disappeared. And then y'all see my PowerPoint again now, right? All right, cool. Okay, so we've kind of talked about recognizing and respecting others' personal space and boundaries. One other tool you could use to kind of help persons with IDD learn about the differences in personal space, especially if you're running a group, is and this is an activity I learned at I'll call it a workshop. Is you have one person stand at one end of the room, and then you have another person stand at the other end, and have one person walk towards the other person until that person says stop. And then when that person says stop, the person that was walking has a sticky note with their name, and they put it on the floor where they stopped. Because what this activity will show usually is those in the group who know each other, um, or potentially are, and this isn't an always, this is a sometimes. So if this doesn't show, don't be thinking you did something wrong. But sometimes people of the same sex will have the posting note closer to the person than those who are complete strangers or the opposite sex. And so that's kind of a visual way to help teach people personal space and how to recognize that. And it's also a good way to help them recognize facial expressions, because sometimes people will have the facial expression of uncomfortable before they speak up. And so that's kind of one of the other things some persons with IDD, including myself, kind of don't always pick up on, is the nonverbal body language. And so it's kind of a way to kind of help show what different types of body language might look like. So so when we're talking about craving hugs, kisses, and other frequent or prolonged contact with others, this is a really big one, because when proper support is not provided and assumptions are made based on the intent of the behavior, it can lead to the person with IDD ending up with a record. Uh, and I'm not sure if that's something a lot of people realize, um, because there is this assumption within society at large that as you get older, there are certain things that you pick up on automatically. And for persons with IDD, that is not always the case. And so it is not fair to persons with IDD to be automatically assuming the intent behind their behavior. Like, for example, with hugs. Uh, when we talked about proprioceptive dysfunction earlier, remember those that exhibit seeking behaviors seek that deep pressure. It's the same thing with tactile dysfunction. It's the deep pressure, and it is, for some persons with IDD, very soothing. Another behavior that is sometimes misinterpreted, and this kind of comes from personal experience, is tickling. Because for me, being tickled or tickling others is actually very relaxing and soothing. And it's the deep pressure you get from tickling someone or being tickled that is relaxing. In fact, if you were to kind of research on tickling, the one thing that they have learned about the type of tickling that makes you laugh is that it releases dopamine, which is one of the feel good hormones. And so it kind of makes sense that in persons who do not necessarily process certain stimuli correctly, it makes sense that you get a stronger dopamine release from certain types of pressure, deep pressure. And so instead of automatically assuming the behavior around someone giving a hug, it's always good and as uncomfortable as this might be for some, but ask questions because it is more harmful to assume than it is to ask questions. Because what happens when you assume is rumors can get spread about someone, and then the person hears about those rumors and feels completely shattered. And this is what sometimes can lead to persons with IDD attempting and or being successful in suicide, because they're people, instead of being supportive and asking questions, they're just automatically assuming, oh, well, that person's always just trying to get in people's pants, or that person is just super weird, or that person is just a perv. And it's like all these types of labels are very traumatizing. And it's not very person centered nor trauma informed if you are helping to contribute to the gossip. So that's my soapbox moment around um, behaviors that are sometimes misinterpreted. So the lesson here is persons with IDD can sometimes use behaviors that may seem immature for their age, like tickling, as a coping mechanism, not always as a mechanism to try and flirt or get into the person's pants. Now, I'm not saying that that is impossible, because um, throughout my life, especially when, I was early into recovery and not fully understanding why tickling is soothing for me, I would get people telling me that that is a kink. And so, of course, being the curious person that I am, I did do research into that. And I actually did go to a dinner with a group of people that tickling is sexual for them. But the dinner was just dinner at a restaurant, so that people are able to socialize and they can kind of screen new people, so to speak. And through that experience, I learned that tickling is not a kink for me, because it doesn't arouse me. It's very calming. It does the opposite. And so, you know, this is something that, I really didn't talk about when I did presentations until I created this one. Um, because of usually the reaction I get from people and how a lot of them don't understand or just didn't want to listen, and keep a open mind. And so, you know, when you're supporting persons with IDD and they seem to have these coping mechanisms that might be misconstrued with the intent or seems kind of inappropriate for their age, you know, instead of judging or assuming, it's better to ask questions, because the one thing that I have kind of learned to help, I guess you would say, fit in within society better is actually using a weighted vest, because weighted vest is another way that my body is able to get deep pressure. And it seems from my experience, people are a lot more open and not as uncomfortable or labeling when I'm just asking them to help tighten one of my side straps because I need more of a squeeze from my vest. Because I've also learned not everyone is comfortable with bear hugs, because bear hugs is also another way some persons with IDD um, use as a coping mechanism when they're overwhelmed or overstimulated. And so, what's important is to not shame the person with IDD or make them feel like they are weird, because those are two things that are a big contributor in persons with IDD attempting and sometimes being successful with suicide. I personally am a 6-time survivor of suicide attempts. Um, I mostly try to overdose on my stimulant medication or pain medication that I have gotten previously. You know, thankfully, you know, next month marks 9 months since I've been in a psychiatric hospital, so I am doing a lot better. But it's because, you know, people, and by people I mean providers, have been willing to work with me and help me learn other coping mechanisms that meet what I need, so that when I am with people, I have multiple coping mechanisms that I can pick from rather than just the ones that I learned early on that a lot of society at large deem as weird, immature, or could potentially uh, end up with a criminal record. I mean, I have been very fortunate that I have never been arrested or accused of any kind of sexual misconduct or anything along those lines. But I do know there are persons with IDD who have not been as fortunate, and it's simply because people aren't asking questions and providers are not providing the proper support, which is helping that person kind of delve into why they're using that behavior and other coping mechanisms that can provide the same or very similar support. Or if we're talking about sensory things, kind of the same type of stimulation. So, how to support tactile seeking behavior? And I know we just had a big spiel on how to support some. So, but other ways are you can use fidget spinners, stress balls, and stretchy bands. Provide a variety of textures in toys, clothing, and food. Play with finger paints, Play-Doh, sand, mud, and other messy objects. I will say personally for me, and I don't know why, but I love the way Play-Doh feels. And so, I'll use that sometimes, but I haven't in a long time. But if it's around, it's something I can use. And then I don't know exactly why, but sand is also very soothing when I run my finger through sand. So there is some science behind this. Yes, kinetic sand. Yes, kinetic sand also feels awesome because I have had the chance to use that um, in the past. Build a sensory table at home and include water, sand, Legos, or other textures. Place Velcro, stickers, or fidgets in study areas to help your child stay focused. Now, another one that's not on here, um, my mouse, it actually has the scroll wheel thingy, but it has another button on it that when I push it in, it gets rid of the friction. So the spinny wheel spins smoother. And then when I push that button again, there's a little bit of a, uh, um, I guess you could call it friction. It's more of bumpiness when I scroll. And that is actually one of the coping mechanisms I use in meetings to help me stay focused. Because switching between having that bumpy rolling and smooth rolling actually helps me focus. Uh, Practice personal ways to respect personal space while eating, playing, lining up, etc. We kind of just spent a whole like 5 or 10 minutes talking about that. By the way, if a lot of these how-to supports seem like they're written for children, it's because they are. Because the other thing um is typically when you're talking about sensory processing issues, when they are picked up on, it's typically during youth, not during adulthood. And so, but even though this is written for youth, these same supports can be helpful for adults as well. And I'm speaking from personal experience when saying that. And then, practice ways to respect personal space while eating, playing, lining up, etc., including the different relationships where physical contact like tickling, back scratches, massages, etc., are and are not appropriate, or refer to appropriate support for teaching this important concept. One resource might be a social skills therapist. All right, so what is tactile avoidant behavior? Tactile avoiders are highly sensitive to touch or temperature and tend to become overwhelmed or distracted by everyday tactile input. Avoiders often have extreme or upsetting reactions to even very mild stimulation. As a result, they can appear withdrawn or defensive and have trouble fitting in with their peers. They also frequently experience symptoms associated with anxiety disorders and engage in repetitive self soothing behaviors. And again, these self soothing behaviors can be both positive or negative. And again, one positive would be self-rocking, a negative would be cutting, which is another thing to kind of understand for those of you who are mental health or substance use providers, because just because someone is cutting does not necessarily 100% mean they're trying to kill themselves. It could be that they're experiencing sensory processing issue and that's how they are coping. And so, if that's the case, it's really, really important to make sure you are supporting them with coping mechanisms that are more healthy for when they're having issues with sensory processing. So tactile avoiders may avoid food, clothing, or food with specific textures, dislike being touched, hugged, or kissed, even by parents, dislike their hair or skin being wet, and avoid swimming and bathing, refuse to wear tight, scratchy, or uncomfortable clothing with seams or tags, become anxious in crowded spaces or when standing even somewhat close to others, and have a low pain threshold and respond to even light touch as if in pain. Now, one thing I wanted to highlight from this slide for those of you who are mental health and substance use providers, one barrier some persons with IDD have in getting treatment, especially if they have co-occurring mental health or substance use, is the anxiety of having other people around. Because I know there are some providers who have very small offices, and so you have to work with what you got. Um, and so one way to kind of help get rid of that barrier is if you kind of notice someone or they kind of mention, being in crowded spaces or just being even somewhat close to others is a big trigger for them. One of the ways to support them is to either have them like the first appointment of the day and let them enter the building a little early, or had them as the very last appointment so that they're less likely to have someone else in the waiting room with them so that they can be comfortable in coming to get help. Because getting help is hard. Because to get help, you kind of have to recognize that something is wrong. And that is usually like the hardest step. At least for me, it was. Um, so I thought I would just kind of talk about that because that might be something that's not typically thought of. Another thing that might not typically be thought of for those of you who work with the homeless population, um, people with bad BO, it might not just be because they're homeless. It could be, or people with mental health or substance use. It might not just be because they're homeless or they're depressed or, they've been on a trip for the past couple of days and so they haven't showered. It could be they have issues with how it feels to have their hair wet or their skin being wet. Another thing I will mention, and I think there are some of you here that work maybe with group homes or in group homes. One thing to kind of keep an eye on, and this is a story that I heard from someone that worked in a group home, especially if you change detergents, because what I have heard a story of is a group home changing detergent and there being a lady there who is mostly nonverbal. And after they changed detergent, all of a sudden they were having issues with this lady keeping her clothes on. And so it took them a little while, but eventually they figured out that she was allergic to the new detergent. So as soon as they switched back to the old detergent, that lady no longer had issues with keeping her clothes on. So, how to support tactile avoidant behavior? Remove tags from clothing and turn uncomfortable items inside out. Put long hair up in a towel or hair tie when bathing or swimming. Buy compression or athletic clothing to wear under loose or scratchy items. Use gloves or tools to engage with new or unpleasant textures. Encourage low contact outdoor games such as racing, tag, or tug of war. However, if the person is one of those who if just putting your hand on their shoulder, they're acting like it is the most excruciating pain they have felt, I would not recommend TAC. So just keep in mind these are suggestions of supports, and not all of these will work for everyone. Warn family and friends ahead of time that hugging and touching is not desired. So, wrapping up, why is it important to keep individuals with IDD potential support needs in mind? Number one, it helps establish and maintain an environment where the individual or individuals feel included and supported. Number two, it decreases the chance of the individual's sensory system being overwhelmed, which can lead to a major increase in their anxiety level, which can be a contributing factor to behavioral outbursts. Number three, provides the individual or individuals the opportunity to realize they can accomplish anything they put their mind to. Fourth, helps support the individual or individuals in their recovery. 5, reduces the possibility of traumatizing and or re-traumatizing the individuals. And 6, provide those with sensory processing disorders like proprioceptive dysfunction and tactile dysfunction the support they need to function and not be taken advantage of and or traumatized from being labeled as predator, perv, weird, etc. Because another thing that can happen for persons with IDD who crave like hugs, bear hugs, might be using tickling as a way to cope, to de-stress, is there are people out there, unfortunately, who pick up on these unusual coping mechanisms and will exploit them to get free rides to places. And I'm speaking from personal experience. Free rides to places, free food, maybe clothing, babysitting, etc. And it's important that persons with IDD learn that a true friend, while it's okay to help them every once in a while, if they're constantly asking for things, then it's not really a friendship. And teaching them how to recognize those red flags so that they're able to get out of the situation without enduring more trauma than they have to. So these are the resources. And I think Jesse can share the PowerPoint via email with all of you.